The attorney said my name like it didn't belong to me anymore. That's the sentence that keeps returning to me late at night when the house settles and the refrigerator hums like it's thinking. He said my name slowly, carefully, the way people do when they're about to change your life or take something from you. I remember the way his pen hovered over the paper, how the sunlight from the tall window cut across his desk, stopping right at his folded hands. "You've inherited $1.9 million, he said. For a moment, the room tilted, not in a dramatic way, just enough to make me grip the arms of the chair and press my heels into the carpet. I could smell lemon cleaner and old books. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang once and stopped. I nodded like I understood, like my body knew what to do with that number. But inside, something cracked open, something tender and frightening and full of memories I wasn't ready to touch. My mother had been gone only 3 months, 3 months since I stood in the kitchen of her house, staring at the dent in the refrigerator door she'd made years ago when she dropped a frozen turkey. 3 months since my sister, Elaine, and I hugged stiffly at the funeral, our arms barely touching, like strangers who shared a last name by accident. I hadn't come to the attorney's office expecting anything like this. I thought we'd talk about paperwork, maybe a few sentimental items, my mother's jewelry box, the old piano bench with the loose leg. I was still wearing grief like a coat I couldn't take off. 1.9, the attorney repeated gently, as if saying it twice might make it easier to carry. I thanked him. I don't remember standing up, but suddenly I was outside, the sun too bright, my phone heavy in my hand. Elaine's name was already pulled up on the screen. I stared at it, thumb hovering, then slipped the phone back into my purse. I told myself I'd call her later. Before all this, before the money, before the suspicion, my life was ordinary in the quietest way. I worked as a records coordinator at a small clinic, the kind of job where no one notices you unless something goes missing. I lived alone in a modest 2-bedroom house with a creaky front step and a maple tree that dropped helicopters all over the lawn in spring. My routines were simple: coffee at 6, toast that burned more often than not, a radio station that played old soul songs my mother loved. On Sundays, I cooked for myself and pretended I didn't miss the sound of someone else moving through the house. Elaine and I had never been close, not since childhood anyway. She was 3 years older, sharper around the edges, always in a hurry to become someone important. I was the quieter one, the listener. When our father died years ago, it was Elaine who handled everything, her voice brisk and efficient on the phone. I let her. It seemed easier that way. Our mother lived with Elaine for the last 5 years of her life. I visited when I could, brought groceries, folded laundry, sat beside the bed when the pain got bad. Elaine was the gatekeeper: medications, appointments, finances. Everyone said how lucky Mom was to have a daughter like her. I believed them. When Mom passed, Elaine called me just after dawn. Her voice was steady, almost rehearsed. "She went peacefully," she said. "I was right there." At the funeral, Elaine cried quietly, dabbing her eyes with a tissue she kept folded just so. People hugged her longer than they hugged me. I stood slightly to the side, hands clasped, absorbing condolences like rain. Afterward, when we sorted through Mom's things, Elaine moved fast. "I'll take care of the legal stuff," she said. "You don't need to worry about that." I didn't argue. Grief makes you tired in ways sleep doesn't fix. The first strange thing happened a week after the attorney's meeting. I received an email from the firm confirming a follow-up appointment, only it wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to her. I stared at the screen, rereading it slowly. Same case number, same estate name, just her email. I told myself it was a clerical error. Those happen. I forwarded it back politely, adding, I think this might have been sent to me by mistake. The reply came an hour later, brief, almost clipped. Apologies. We'll correct the file. Still, something tightened in my chest. When I mentioned it to Elaine later that evening, she laughed lightly. Oh, that firm is a mess. They probably just mix things up. Her laugh didn't reach her eyes. Over the next few weeks, small things piled up like dust you don't notice until it coats everything. The attorney rescheduled twice. Documents that were supposed to be mailed never arrived. When I called, the receptionist put me on hold longer than necessary, her tone suddenly formal. One afternoon, while cleaning out a box of Mom's papers I'd brought home, I found a copy of her will, or what looked like one. The signature at the bottom wavered strangely, nothing like the strong, looping signature I'd seen all my life. My mother's hand had been shaky near the end, but this felt off. I held the paper close, breathing in the faint smell of old ink and lavender. My mother had always smelled like lavender. I told myself I was imagining things. Grief makes you suspicious. Grief rewrites memories. Still, that night I lay awake listening to the clock tick, each second loud in the dark. I thought about Elaine, how tired she'd looked these last years, how much responsibility she carried. I thought about money and how it changes the way people see each other. I didn't want to believe anything bad, but something had already shifted, a quiet crack running just beneath the surface. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. The days after that email felt heavier, like the air before a storm that refuses to break. I went back to my routines, but they no longer fit the same way. Coffee tasted thin. The radio songs felt too loud. Even the maple tree outside seemed to drop its helicopters with a kind of impatience, tapping against the windows as if asking me why I was pretending everything was normal. At work, I found myself staring at files without seeing them. My coworker, Janice, asked if I was feeling all right. I told her I was just tired. That was easier than explaining the way my thoughts kept circling the same questions over and over, like a dog worrying a bone. At night, I sorted through more of my mother's things. Old birthday cards, recipe clippings, a stack of envelopes tied with a faded blue ribbon. I sat cross-legged on the living room floor, the lamp casting a soft yellow circle around me. The house smelled faintly of dust and lemon polish. I found a notebook tucked into the back of a drawer. My mother's handwriting filled the pages, lists, reminders, small reflections written in the margins. Toward the back, there were notes about appointments, medications, and finances. Met with Elaine today, one entry read. She says she'll handle the paperwork. I trust her, but I worry she's tired. I closed the notebook slowly. Trust. That word pressed against my ribs. Elaine called a few days later, her voice bright in that practiced way. I spoke to the attorney, she said. Things are moving along. I asked her when the next meeting was. There was a pause, just a second too long. They haven't scheduled it yet, she said. You know how these things go. I did know, or at least I thought I did. Did they mention the amount? I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Another pause. What amount? The inheritance, I said. They told me it was 1.9 million. Her breath caught, just barely, but I heard it. Oh, she said. That single word landed between us like a dropped plate. Well, she continued, you know those numbers aren't always accurate at first. Estates can be complicated. I agreed, even as something inside me tightened further. After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen staring at the sink, watching a slow drip from the faucet count out the seconds. That night, I dreamed of my mother standing at the end of a long hallway calling my name. Every time I tried to reach her, the floor shifted beneath me. The first real clue came disguised as kindness. Elaine showed up at my house one Saturday morning with a box of pastries. She hugged me longer than usual, her arms stiff around my shoulders. "I've been thinking," she said, setting the box on the counter, "about Mom, about us." I waited. She nodded, eyes earnest. "So I was thinking it might be best if we just simplify things. Let me manage the estate, handle the funds, and then we can decide together how it's used for good things, scholarships, donations, things Mom would have wanted." I studied her face, the faint lines around her mouth, the way her fingers tapped lightly against the counter. "What about the will?" I asked. "Have you seen the final version?" She waved a hand. "Oh yes, it's all taken care of." Something in her tone closed the door on further questions. After she left, I opened my laptop and searched for the attorney's firm. I reread every email they'd sent me. The language was careful, formal, nothing outright wrong. Still, I called the office on Monday. The receptionist put me on hold. The music played too long. Finally, a junior associate came on the line. His voice was polite but distant. "We're currently reviewing some updated documents," he said. "Updated how?" I asked. Another pause. "I'd have to check with the senior attorney." "Please do, and call me back." He didn't. That afternoon, I drove to my mother's old neighborhood. Elaine still lived in the house. I parked across the street, telling myself I was just going to say hello. Through the front window, I saw her at the dining table with a man I didn't recognize. Papers were spread out between them. He pointed at something, and Elaine nodded, her jaw set. I didn't go inside. I sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my ears. That evening, I finally did something I'd been avoiding. I called a different attorney. He listened quietly as I explained, his questions precise. When I mentioned the signature on the will, he asked me to bring it in. "Sometimes," he said gently, "what feels like paranoia is actually instinct." I hung up the phone and sat in the dark, the weight of his words settling over me. Elaine had always been the capable one, the strong one, the one who handled things. But as I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, I understood something I hadn't before. Capability and honesty are not the same thing. And whatever was happening with my mother's estate, it was no longer just about money. It was about truth, and whether I was brave enough to face it. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, my thoughts picked up where they'd left off, replaying moments I'd once dismissed. Elaine's quick answers, her firm grip on every decision, the way she'd always insisted she knew what was best for everyone. What I used to call strength now felt like control. The next morning, I drove to the second attorney's office with the will folded carefully in my bag, as if it were something fragile and alive. The waiting room smelled like stale coffee and carpet cleaner. A small fountain bubbled in the corner, the sound meant to soothe, but somehow making me more aware of how fast my heart was beating. Mr. Halverson was in his late 50s, with silver hair and kind, tired eyes. He didn't rush me. He listened. When I handed him the will, he studied it in silence, adjusting his glasses. His finger traced the signature slowly. "This doesn't look like a natural variation," he said finally. "Your mother's signature appears guided." Guided. The word made my stomach drop. "Are you saying it's forged?" I asked. "I'm saying it warrants investigation." He explained the process in careful terms: handwriting analysis, document verification, formal requests to the estate's managing attorney. It sounded expensive, complicated, public. I thought of Elaine, of our mother's words in that notebook. "I trust her, but I worry she's tired." I left his office with a folder of information and a knot in my chest that wouldn't loosen. That evening, Elaine called again. Her voice was strained, the brightness gone. "You went to another lawyer," she said. I didn't ask how she knew. "Yes," I said, "I did." There was a long silence on the line. I imagined her pacing her living room, the floorboards creaking the way they always had. "You don't trust me," she said finally. "I want clarity," I replied. "That's not the same thing." She sighed, sharp and frustrated. "You're overthinking this. Mom wanted things handled efficiently. She said so." "Then why is the will different from the one she showed me years ago?" I asked. Her voice hardened. "People change their minds." "Not their signatures," I said quietly. The line went dead. The days that followed felt like walking through fog. Elaine stopped answering my calls. The original attorney's office sent a brief letter stating that the estate was under review and that further communication would be limited. At work, I dropped a file folder and papers scattered across the floor. As I knelt to gather them, my hands shook. Janice crouched beside me, her voice low. "You don't have to go through everything alone," she said. I smiled at her, grateful, but said nothing. Instead, I spent my evenings reading estate law, fraud cases, stories of families torn apart by money. Each one felt uncomfortably familiar. Then one night, I found the email. It was buried in my mother's old account, one I'd helped her check when her eyesight started to fail. The subject line read, "Will update." The message was from Elaine. "I've attached the revised document. As discussed, this reflects what we talked about. I'll take care of the rest." There was no reply from my mother. I sat back in my chair, the room spinning. My mother had been heavily medicated at the time that email was sent. She barely recognized me on some days. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan. I confronted Elaine 2 days later. I drove to her house without calling first. She opened the door slowly, her expression guarded. "We need to talk," I said. She stepped aside, letting me in. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and something burnt, toast maybe. Papers were stacked neatly on the dining table. I placed the printed email in front of her. Her eyes flicked to it, then away. "You went through Mom's emails?" she asked. "I helped her manage them, you know that." She sank into a chair, rubbing her temples. For a moment, she looked older than I'd ever seen her. "I did what I had to do," she said quietly. "For whom?" I asked. "For all of us," she snapped. "You think you could handle that kind of money? You've always avoided responsibility." The words stung more than I expected. "This isn't about my capability, it's about honesty." She laughed, bitter and sharp. "Honesty doesn't keep the lights on. Mom needed stability. I provided that." "You forged her will. You manipulated the estate." Her jaw clenched. "She would have agreed if she'd understood." "That's not consent," I replied. For a moment, I thought she might cry. Instead, she straightened, her voice cold. "If you pursue this, you'll destroy what's left of our family." I looked at her, the sister I'd defended for years, the woman who had sat beside our mother's bed and held her hand. "I think you already did." Walking back to my car, my legs felt weak. The sky was heavy with clouds, the air thick and pressing. I sat behind the wheel, hands resting uselessly in my lap, and cried, not loudly but deeply, from a place I didn't know existed. This wasn't just about money, it was about trust and how easily it can be bent into something unrecognizable. I called Mr. Halverson the next morning. "I want to proceed," I said. There was a pause on the line, then a steady voice. "All right, we'll do this carefully." As I hung up, I felt both terrified and strangely calm. The truth had a cost. I was about to find out how high it would be. Once I said yes, there was no going back. The decision settled into my bones like a weight I'd agreed to carry, even if I didn't yet understand how heavy it would become. Mr. Halverson moved methodically. He requested copies of every version of my mother's will on record, subpoenaed email communications, and initiated a formal handwriting analysis. Each step felt both necessary and invasive, like reopening a wound to make sure it healed clean. I spent my evenings answering questions, dates, conversations, small moments I'd never imagined would matter. When did my mother's handwriting start to shake? How often did Elaine accompany her to appointments? Did anyone else witness discussions about estate changes? I answered as honestly as I could, though doubt crept in around the edges. Memory is a fragile thing. Grief distorts it. Elaine didn't speak to me at all. When she did appear in my life, it was indirectly, through curt emails forwarded by attorneys, through relatives calling to check in with voices tight with judgment. My Aunt Ruth called one afternoon. "Elaine says you're trying to take everything," she said carefully. "I'm trying to protect what Mom left," I replied. Ruth sighed. Families don't recover from things like this. I didn't say what I was thinking, that sometimes families are already broken and pretending otherwise doesn't fix it. The handwriting expert's report arrived in a thick envelope. I sat at my kitchen table, the envelope unopened for a long time, my tea growing cold beside me. When I finally read it, my hand shook. The conclusion was clear. The signature on the final will showed significant indicators of forgery. I pressed my palm flat against the table, grounding myself. A strange mix of relief and grief washed over me. Relief that I hadn't imagined it, grief that I hadn't. Mr. Halverson called that evening. "This strengthens your case considerably," he said. "What happens next?" I asked. "We notify the court and the estate's current administrators." The word court echoed in my head long after the call ended. Elaine showed up at my house 2 days later. I saw her car from the window and felt my stomach knot. She knocked softly, then harder. When I opened the door, her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair pulled back too tightly. "You didn't have to do this," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I did," I replied. She paced the living room, gesturing sharply. "Do you have any idea what this is going to do to me, to my reputation?" I folded my arms. "You should have thought about that before you forged Mom's will." She stopped pacing. "I was protecting her legacy." "By lying?" I asked. Her voice cracked then. "By keeping things from falling apart." I softened just a little. "Elaine, we could have talked. You didn't have to do this alone." She looked at me, really looked, and for a moment I saw fear instead of anger. "You've always let me carry the burden," she said. "I didn't think you'd suddenly decide to fight." "I didn't decide suddenly," I said quietly. "I decided when I realized you didn't trust me with the truth." She left without another word. The weeks leading up to the hearing blurred together. Paperwork, depositions, late-night calls with my attorney. Each step stripped away another layer of denial. At work, I requested time off. The clinic's fluorescent lights made my head ache. I found myself staring at the clock, counting minutes until I could go home and sit in silence. The first time I sat in the courtroom, the air felt heavy, formal. Elaine sat across from me, her back straight, her face carefully neutral. Our eyes met briefly, then slid away. The judge listened patiently as evidence was presented. The emails, the handwriting report, testimony from the attorney who'd overseen the revised will, who admitted under oath that he'd never met privately with my mother. That detail landed hard. When Elaine's lawyer argued that the changes reflected my mother's intent, I felt a familiar anger rise. Intent without consent, efficiency without ethics. I took the stand last. My voice shook at first, then steadied as I spoke about my mother, her values, her carefulness, her love for both her daughters. I described the way she'd signed her name on birthday cards, strong and looping, even when her hands ached. She believed in fairness, and she believed in telling the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. Elaine stared at the table. The ruling didn't come that day. The judge took the matter under advisement. Waiting was its own kind of torture. Every phone call made my heart jump. Every unknown number felt like a verdict. When the decision finally arrived, it was delivered in a plain envelope, unremarkable in every way. The court found the final will invalid. The earlier version, signed years before, when my mother was healthy, would stand. I sat on the edge of my bed and let the news wash over me. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, sad, vindicated in a quiet, hollow way. Elaine called that night. Her voice was subdued. "You've won." "I didn't want to win," I replied. "I wanted honesty." She didn't answer. In the days that followed, the story spread, not in dramatic headlines, but in whispers, family gatherings, church parking lots, phone calls that ended abruptly. Elaine withdrew. Some relatives sided with her, others avoided us both. The money remained untouched, held in trust while remaining details were resolved. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun dip behind the trees, I realized something. Justice doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives quietly, leaving you alone with what's been lost and what still needs healing. After the ruling, life didn't snap back into place the way people expected to. There was no sense of closure, no neat bow tied around the months of tension and grief. Instead, everything felt suspended, like the moment after a storm, when the air is still and you're waiting to see what survived. The inheritance stayed locked in legal limbo while final accounting was completed. I didn't touch a dollar of it. I didn't even think about what I might do with the money. It felt almost disrespectful, like counting candles before the cake was baked. What I did think about was my mother. I found myself returning to her old house more often, walking through the rooms Elaine now kept immaculate and impersonal. The living room rug still bore the faint impression of where my mother's recliner had been. In the hallway closet, her coat hung exactly where she'd left it, the pockets still holding a crumpled tissue and a penny. One afternoon, while Elaine was out, I sat at the kitchen table and reread the notebook I'd found weeks earlier. The pages felt thinner now, the ink more fragile. Near the back, there was an entry I hadn't noticed before. "If something happens to me," my mother had written, "I want my girls to remember that money is only a tool. Love is the inheritance." I closed the notebook and rested my forehead against the table. For the first time since this all began, I cried for my mother, not for the betrayal, not for the conflict, but for the quiet loss of her voice in my life. Elaine and I didn't speak for weeks. When she finally reached out, it was through a message, not a call. "Can we talk?" it read. I stared at my phone for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to protect the fragile calm I'd built. Another part, the part my mother had nurtured, knew avoidance wouldn't bring peace. We met at a small cafe halfway between our houses, the kind with chipped mugs and handwritten menus. Elaine arrived early, her coffee untouched. She looked smaller somehow, tired. "She didn't sleep much," she said. "Neither did I replied. She folded her hands on the table. "I need you to understand why I did it." "I'm listening," I said. She spoke slowly, carefully, about the years she'd spent managing bills, appointments, medications, about her fear of losing control, about her belief that she was the only one strong enough to handle the responsibility. "I was afraid you'd waste it or that it would destroy you," she admitted. I met her gaze. "You didn't give me the chance to decide that for myself." She nodded, eyes glistening. "I know." There was a long silence between us, filled only by the clink of dishes and low murmur of other conversations. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said finally. "Not yet." She swallowed. "I don't expect you to." The public consequences arrived quietly but firmly. Elaine stepped down from a volunteer leadership role she'd held for years. Word spread about the court case, and with it, questions. People who once praised her efficiency now spoke in careful tones. The attorney who had colluded with her faced disciplinary review. The firm issued a public apology and restructured its oversight procedures. I watched all of this from a distance, feeling oddly detached. Justice, when it comes, doesn't always feel satisfying. Sometimes it just feels necessary. When the estate was finally released, the funds were transferred into a trust in my name with clear instructions and oversight. $1.9 million sat on a piece of paper, impersonal and unreal. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I paid off my modest mortgage, I set aside money for retirement, I established a small scholarship fund in my mother's name at the community college she had attended as a young woman. Each decision felt grounded, deliberate, not extravagant, respectful. Elaine sent me a letter a month later. It was handwritten. The familiar slant of her script made my chest ache. She apologized, not defensively, not conditionally. She acknowledged the harm she'd caused, the trust she'd broken. "I don't know if we can ever be what we were," she wrote, "but I hope someday we can be something honest." I closed the notebook and rested my forehead against the table. For the first time since this all began, I cried for my mother. Not for the betrayal, not for the conflict, but for the quiet loss of her voice in my life. One evening, as I watered the maple tree in my yard, I felt a quiet sense of grounding. The helicopters had fallen, carpeting the grass in green. Life was still moving forward, indifferent to my pain, yet offering new moments all the same. I thought about the word inheritance. It isn't just money passed down. It's values, choices, the courage to do what's right even when it costs you someone you love. And in that sense, my mother had given me more than I ever expected. The quiet after everything settled was the strangest part. I had imagined that once the legal dust cleared, once the money was released and the truth acknowledged, I would feel lighter, free. But what came instead was a deep, unfamiliar stillness, like standing in a room after the furniture has been moved out, recognizable yet echoing. I took a few weeks off work, not because I needed rest exactly, but because I needed space to hear myself think. Mornings stretched longer. I let the coffee brew an extra minute. I sat on the porch and watched neighbors leave for their jobs, their lives continuing at a pace I no longer felt synced with. Money changes the way time behaves. Suddenly, urgency loosens its grip, but so does structure. I realized how much of my life had been shaped by staying small, by letting others lead, by convincing myself that peace meant silence. That realization didn't feel empowering at first. It felt like regret. Elaine and I existed in a careful truce. We exchanged occasional messages, neutral, polite, updates about family matters, nothing personal, nothing deep. I heard through others that she'd started therapy, that she was struggling with the loss of her identity as the responsible one. I didn't feel vindicated hearing that. I felt sad. We are shaped by the roles we're given and by the ones we take without question. One afternoon, I drove to the cemetery alone. I hadn't been back since the funeral. The sky was pale, stretched thin with clouds. I found my mother's headstone and sat on the grass beside it. "I hope I did the right thing," I said aloud, my voice barely louder than the wind. I imagined what she might say, something gentle, practical, something about standing up straight and telling the truth. As I stood to leave, I noticed a small stone placed at the base of the marker, a tradition, a sign of remembrance. I didn't know who had left it, Elaine maybe, or someone else who'd loved her quietly. Grief, I was learning, doesn't belong to one person. I went back to work in early autumn. The clinic smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee. Janice hugged me a little longer than usual. "You look different," she said. "Do I?" I asked. "Stronger," she replied. "Quieter, but stronger." I took that as a compliment. With the financial cushion now real instead of theoretical, I made a decision I'd postponed for years. I reduced my hours, took on projects that mattered to me, volunteered at the community college scholarship office once a week, meeting students whose lives might shift in small but meaningful ways. One young woman thanked me with tears in her eyes. "You don't know what this means," she said. I thought of my mother, of her careful budgeting and gentle encouragements. Yes, I thought, I do. Elaine called me unexpectedly one evening. "I'm selling the house," she said. "My mother's house." "Oh," I replied. "I can't stay there," she continued. "Every room reminds me of what I did wrong." I didn't know what to say to that, so I listened. "I'm moving closer to the city," she added, "starting over." "Sometimes that helps," I said. There was a pause. "I'm proud of you," suddenly she said, "for standing your ground." The words caught me off guard. My throat tightened. "Thank you," I said. We didn't say more than that. We didn't need to. Winter came quietly that year. Snow dusted the maple tree. I hung a small wreath on the door, nothing elaborate. I hosted a modest dinner for a few friends who didn't ask questions, who simply brought food and laughter and warmth. As the evening wound down, I stood at the sink washing dishes, the window fogged with steam. I thought about the woman I'd been at the beginning of this story, the one who nodded politely in an attorney's office, afraid to ask too much. That woman hadn't disappeared. She'd grown. Strength, I was discovering, doesn't announce itself. It settles in slowly in the choices you make when no one is watching. I didn't know what the future would hold for Elaine and me. Forgiveness, if it came, would come on its own timeline. Trust would have to be rebuilt brick by brick, or not at all. But I knew this much. I had honored my mother, not by staying quiet, but by telling the truth. And that, more than the money, was the inheritance that would last. By the time spring returned, I could feel something loosening inside me. Not healing, not yet, but a softening, the kind that comes when you stop bracing for impact and start letting life move around you again. The maple tree outside my house bloomed early that year, its buds small and stubborn, pushing through the cold as if they had something to prove. I spent more time outdoors, long walks in the evening, hands in my pockets, shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't been for months. Neighbors waved, dogs barked, life continued in its ordinary, persistent way. Elaine and I remained careful, cordial. We exchanged birthday messages, short updates, nothing that ventured into the emotional deep end. And that was okay. One afternoon, I received a call from Mr. Halverson. "I wanted to check in," he said, "see how you're doing." "I'm adjusting," I replied honestly. He paused. "You handled this with a lot of integrity. That's not always easy." After the call, I sat quietly for a while, thinking about that word, integrity. It's not flashy, it doesn't win you friends, but it lets you sleep at night. The first real test of my resolve came unexpectedly. A distant cousin, someone I barely knew, reached out asking for financial help. Word had spread about the inheritance, despite my efforts to keep things private. The request was polite, but heavy with expectation. I took a deep breath before responding. I explained that the money was already allocated, that I wasn't in a position to help. The guilt came anyway, that old reflex to appease, to explain myself. But I sat with it, let it pass. Boundaries, I was learning, are a form of self-respect. One evening, Elaine showed up at my door, unannounced. I stood there for a moment before opening it, my heart pounding softly. When I did, she smiled faintly, hands tucked into her coat pockets. "I was in the neighborhood," she said. I stepped aside, letting her in. She looked around the living room, taking in the small changes I'd made, a new lamp, fresh curtains, a framed photo of our mother in her younger years. "She would have liked this," Elaine said. "I think so too," I replied. We sat on the couch, a careful distance between us. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just cautious. I've been thinking a lot, Elaine said, about control, about fear. I listened. She continued, I thought if I managed everything, nothing bad could happen, but all I did was make things worse. I nodded. Fear does that. She looked at me then, really looked. I'm sorry, she said, not just for the will, for all the times I didn't treat you like an equal. The words settled slowly, meaningfully. Thank you, I said. That matters. We didn't hug, not yet, but when she left, the air felt lighter. Later that night, I pulled out my mother's notebook again. I added my own entry, something I'd never thought I'd do. Today, I chose honesty over harmony, I wrote, and it hurt, but it also healed something I didn't know was broken. I closed the notebook, feeling a quiet sense of continuity, like a conversation stretching through time. As summer approached, I made a decision that surprised even me. I enrolled in a part-time counseling course at the community college, not to change careers exactly, but to understand people better, to understand myself. Sitting in a classroom again felt strange at first, but as discussions unfolded about ethics, boundaries, human behavior, I found myself engaged in a way I hadn't been in years. One evening, a classmate said, "You ask good questions." I smiled. I've had a lot of practice lately. Elaine and I met for lunch a few weeks later. The conversation flowed more easily this time. We laughed briefly about a childhood memory, something small and harmless. It felt like a truce turning into something else. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but possibility. I didn't rush it. I didn't need to, because I finally understood something that had taken me most of my life to learn. Peace doesn't come from keeping everything together. It comes from allowing the truth to stand, even when it shakes the foundation, and from trusting yourself enough to rebuild. By late summer, the heat settled into everything. Sidewalks, skin, conversations. It slowed people down, made them more honest somehow. Or maybe I was the one who had changed, finally willing to notice the undercurrents instead of skimming the surface. Elaine and I began meeting more regularly. Nothing formal, just coffee now and then, a walk, a shared silence that no longer felt like punishment. We avoided talking about the money, not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer felt like the point. What lingered between us was heavier and lighter all at once. Years of imbalance, of unspoken expectations. One afternoon, while we sat on a park bench watching children chase pigeons, Elaine said, I always thought if I didn't stay in control, everything would fall apart. I nodded. I thought if I spoke up, I'd lose everyone. She looked at me with a small, sad smile. Funny how fear teaches us opposite lessons. I didn't answer. Some truths don't need commentary. That fall, the scholarship fund awarded its first recipients. I attended the small ceremony at the college auditorium, sitting in the second row, hands folded neatly in my lap. When my mother's name was read aloud, something in my chest tightened, not painfully, but with recognition. Her legacy was no longer tied to a contested document or a court ruling. It lived here, in opportunity, in quiet encouragement passed forward. A young man approached me afterward. My mom passed away last year, he said softly. This helps more than you know. I placed my hand over his briefly. I'm glad, I said. Driving home that evening, the sky streaked pink and gold. I felt a calm gratitude settle over me. Not happiness, something deeper, more durable. Elaine called later that week. I've been asked to speak at a support group, she said, for caregivers. That sounds right, I replied. I want to talk about mistakes, about what happens when you don't ask for help. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. That could help someone. She hesitated. I learned that from you. The admission stayed with me long after we hung up. There were still moments of doubt. Some nights I lay awake replaying old conversations, wondering if I could have intervened earlier. If I'd spoken up sooner, could all of this have been avoided? But regret is a bottomless well. I learned to stop drawing from it. Instead, I focused on what was within reach. I renovated the spare bedroom into a small study, nothing fancy, just a desk by the window, shelves for books, a plant that thrived in the afternoon light. It became my thinking space, my grounding place. Sometimes I imagined my mother sitting across from me, nodding approvingly. Other times I imagined my younger self, quiet, unsure, watching me with curiosity. "You're allowed to take up space," I told her silently. The holidays came and went without incident. Elaine and I attended the same family gathering for the first time since the court case. There were awkward moments, careful smiles, but no open hostility. When Elaine and I stood side by side washing dishes, she handed me a towel without a word. Our hands brushed briefly. It felt normal. Later, as I drove home through softly falling snow, I realized something surprising. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned itself out, leaving behind clarity. And in that clarity, there was room for compassion. Not excuses, not absolution, but understanding. People don't always betray you because they're cruel. Sometimes they do it because they're afraid. Early the next year, I received a letter from the disciplinary board overseeing the attorney involved in the case. Their investigation was complete. Consequences had been imposed. I read the letter once, then filed it away. That chapter was closed. On a quiet Sunday morning, Elaine and I met at the cemetery together. We stood side by side in the cold air, hands tucked into our coats. Neither of us spoke first. "I miss her," Elaine said finally. "I do too," I replied. She placed a small bouquet at the base of the stone. I added a smooth white pebble. We stood there longer than necessary. Before we left, Elaine turned to me. "Thank you," she said, "for not walking away." I thought about that, about how close I'd come. "Thank you," I said back, "for choosing to change." Driving home, I felt something settle into place. Not forgiveness, at least not the kind people expect, but peace. The kind that doesn't erase the past, but allows you to live with it honestly. And that, I realized, was enough. Peace, I learned, doesn't announce itself with certainty. It arrives quietly, like a guest who doesn't want to impose. You don't notice it at first. Only later do you realize the house feels warmer, the silence less sharp. By the time another spring arrived, my life had found a new rhythm. Not the old one, too much had changed for that, but something steadier, something honest. I woke earlier now, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Mornings belonged to me again. I'd sit at the small desk in my study, sunlight spilling across the pages of whatever book I was reading, and let my thoughts wander without fear of where they might lead. Elaine and I spoke weekly, sometimes about practical things, sometimes about nothing at all. We didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. We simply stopped letting it dictate every moment of the present. One afternoon, she asked if I'd like to visit the house with her, the house she was preparing to sell. "I think it's time," she said. I agreed. Walking through my mother's house again felt different this time, less like a crime scene, more like a memory preserved in amber. The walls echoed faintly, the way they do when a place is in transition. Elaine moved slowly from room to room, touching door frames, pausing by windows. When we reached the kitchen, she stopped. "I used to think this house belonged to me," she said quietly, "because I took care of it, of her." I leaned against the counter. "It belonged to all of us," I said, "but mostly it belonged to her." Elaine nodded. "I forgot that." In the living room, she handed me a small box. "I found these when I was packing," she said. Inside were old photographs, birthday parties, holidays, two girls standing side by side, one taller, one quieter, both smiling. "You should have them," Elaine said. "You remember things better than I do." I accepted the box, my throat tight. Thank you. That simple exchange felt like a turning point, not dramatic, just right. Later that week, I received an email from the community college. The scholarship fund had grown. Anonymous donations had been made, small amounts, steady. I suspected Elaine might have been one of the donors, but I didn't ask. Some gestures don't need acknowledgement. There were still moments when the weight of everything pressed down on me unexpectedly. A song on the radio, a familiar phrase spoken in my mother's cadence. Grief doesn't follow a schedule. But I no longer fought it. One evening, while walking past the maple tree, I noticed how much it had grown. The branches stretched farther now, leaves fuller, shade deeper. I smiled. Growth often happens quietly. I finished my counseling course that summer. At the final session, the instructor asked us what we'd learned. When it was my turn, I said that conflict doesn't always mean failure. Sometimes it's the doorway to truth. The instructor nodded, eyes thoughtful. Elaine invited me to dinner at her new apartment in the city. It was small, bright, sparsely furnished. "I'm still figuring out who I am without being in charge of everything," she said, setting plates on the table. "You don't have to figure it out all at once," I replied. She laughed softly. "You sound like a counselor." "Occupational hazard," I said. We ate quietly, comfortably. No tension, no performance. At the end of the night, as I stood to leave, she hugged me. Not tightly, not desperately, just sincerely. It surprised us both. Driving home, I reflected on how fragile reconciliation can be, how easily it can be confused with forgetting. I hadn't forgotten, but I had chosen something else. I had chosen to live forward, not backward. The inheritance no longer felt like a looming presence in my life. It existed in the background, supporting rather than defining me. I used it thoughtfully, sparingly, always with intention. Sometimes I imagined my mother watching, not judging, not measuring, but simply witnessing. That thought brought me comfort. On the anniversary of her passing, Elaine and I lit candles separately, then called each other afterward. We shared one memory each. "That time she made pancakes for dinner," Elaine said, smiling through the phone. "When she taught me how to balance a checkbook," I replied. We laughed softly. The call ended without ceremony. As I sat alone later that night, candle flickering, I thought about how close I'd come to walking away from the truth, from my sister, from myself. Standing up had cost me comfort. Silence would have cost me everything else. And in choosing honesty, I had found something unexpected. Not victory, but alignment. My life, finally, felt like it belonged to me. By the time summer returned again, the sharp edges of everything had softened. Not disappeared, just smoothed by time and repetition, like stones at the bottom of a river. Life no longer felt like something I was bracing against. It felt like something I was finally allowed to move with. I noticed it first in small ways. The way I spoke more slowly, without apologizing for taking up space in a conversation. The way I said no without rehearsing an explanation in my head. The way my shoulders no longer rose toward my ears every time my phone rang. Strength, I was learning, isn't loud, it's steady. Elaine and I settled into a rhythm that surprised us both. We didn't try to reclaim the closeness we never really had. Instead, we built something new. Adult, imperfect, honest. We met for coffee, sometimes dinner, sometimes weeks passed without a word, and neither of us took it personally. One afternoon, while we were walking along the river path near her apartment, she stopped suddenly. "I used to resent you," she said. I waited. "You were allowed to be gentle," she continued. "Gentleness was weakness, so I hardened myself." I looked out at the water, sunlight skipping across its surface. "Gentleness isn't weakness," I said. "It just looks that way to people who are tired of being strong." She nodded slowly, as if filing that thought away for later. The counseling work stayed with me. I began volunteering more regularly, sitting with people who were navigating their own quiet crises, inheritances, divorces, estranged children. I listened more than I spoke. I recognized the look in their eyes when they said, "I don't want to cause trouble." That phrase had shaped so much of my life. "You're not causing trouble," I told one woman gently. "You're responding to it." She cried then. So did I, later, in my car. There were moments, now rare, when anger resurfaced. It usually arrived unannounced, attached to a memory I hadn't yet metabolized. Elaine standing between me and information, the attorney's careful omissions, the way people assumed I wouldn't fight back. When it happened, I let myself feel it. Anger has its place. It's a signal, not a destination. I no longer mistook peace for passivity. That autumn, I was invited to speak briefly at the college during a donor appreciation event. I almost declined. Public speaking had never been my strength, but something inside me, older, steadier, said yes. Standing at the podium, looking out at a room of strangers, I felt the familiar flutter of nerves. I placed my hands on the wood, grounding myself. This scholarship was created in my mother's name, but it exists because of choices, some difficult, some painful, that forced me to decide what integrity meant to me. The room was silent. Money can expose fault lines, but it can also clarify values. My hope is that this fund does more than help with tuition. I hope it reminds students that doing the right thing is rarely easy, but it is always worth it. When I stepped down, my knees were shaking. Elaine met me near the back of the room. Her eyes were wet. "She would have been proud," she said. I believed her. Later that night, alone in my study, I opened my mother's notebook one last time. The pages were worn now, corners softened by repeated handling. I turned to the blank space at the end. "I didn't lose my family," I wrote. "I learned how to meet them honestly." I closed the notebook and placed it back on the shelf where it belonged, not hidden, not clutched, just present. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell quietly, blanketing the yard before dawn. I stood at the window, mug warm in my hands, watching the world reset itself. I thought about how close I'd come to accepting silence as peace, about how easily inheritance can become a battleground instead of a bridge, about how my sister and I had both been trying, in our own flawed ways, to protect something we loved. The cost had been high, but the lesson had been higher. On New Year's Day, Elaine texted me a single sentence: "Thank you for not letting me become someone I couldn't live with." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I replied, "Thank you for choosing to face it." As the year unfolded, I carried that lesson with me, not like a burden, but like a compass. When faced with discomfort, I asked myself, what's true? When tempted to stay quiet, I asked, at what cost? Those questions became anchors. Looking back now, I understand something I didn't then. The inheritance wasn't the money. It was the moment I realized my voice mattered. And once you learn that, really learn it, you never unlearn it. Time has a way of testing what we think we've already healed. Just when you believe a wound has closed, life presses a thumb against it, not to reopen it, but to see if it still aches. That's how it felt when the past came back, not loudly, but politely, asking to be acknowledged one last time. It started with a letter. Not legal, not threatening, just official. The envelope bore the seal of the county probate office. I stood at my kitchen counter staring at it longer than necessary, my coffee cooling beside me. For a moment, my body remembered the old fear before my mind caught up. I opened it slowly. The estate had been fully finalized, accounts closed, records archived, no further actions required. That was it. No ceremony, no emotion in the wording, just a quiet full stop at the end of a long, painful sentence. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. Elaine called that evening. "I got the notice too," she said. "How do you feel?" I asked. She paused. "Relieved," she said, "and sad." I understood that combination well. "Do you want to come by?" she asked. "I made soup, too much of it." I smiled. "Sure." Her apartment smelled like garlic and thyme when I arrived. She'd set the table carefully, like it mattered. We ate slowly, talking about ordinary things, the weather, a show she'd started watching, a book I'd just finished. Halfway through the meal, she set her spoon down. "I've been thinking about Mom," she said, "about how much of myself I wrapped around being needed." I waited. "She never asked me to sacrifice myself," Elaine continued. "I chose that, and then I resented everyone for it." I nodded. "I chose the opposite," I said. "I disappeared and resented you for filling the space." We looked at each other then, both seeing the same truth from different sides. "No one taught us how to share responsibility," Elaine said quietly. "No," I agreed, "but we're learning now." That night, walking home, I felt a surprising lightness, not because everything had been resolved perfectly, but because it had been resolved honestly. There is a difference. A few weeks later, I was invited to a small family gathering, nothing formal, just cousins and aunts who had kept their distance during the worst of it. I hesitated before going. Old dynamics have long memories. But I went. The living room buzzed with cautious warmth, polite questions, careful laughter. No one mentioned the court case directly, but it hovered there like a shadow that had lost its teeth. At one point, my Aunt Ruth pulled me aside. "She was hard on you," she said. "I believed Elaine because it was easier." I considered her words, then nodded. "I understand." And I did. Comfort is persuasive. She squeezed my hand. "Your mother would have admired your courage." That sentence followed me home. I noticed a shift in how people spoke to me after that. Not deference, not pity, respect. It showed up in small ways, people asking my opinion and waiting for the answer, listening without interrupting, trusting that I meant what I said. It took me a while to realize they weren't the only ones changing, so was I. That spring, I made a quiet but significant decision. I updated my own will. It felt strange, almost morbid, sitting at my desk thinking about a future without me. But I did it carefully, thoughtfully. I wrote letters to be included, nothing dramatic, just words of clarity and care. I left instructions not just for money, but for memory. Tell Elaine I forgave her, not because she asked, but because I needed to be free. I sealed the envelope with steady hands. Elaine and I began attending therapy together once a month, not because we were in crisis, but because we didn't want to be again. Those sessions were uncomfortable at times. Old patterns surfaced, defensive instincts flared, but we stayed. One afternoon, the therapist asked, "What do you fear most now?" Elaine answered first, "Becoming controlling again." I took a breath. "Becoming invisible." The therapist nodded. "Then your work is to notice when those fears show up and choose differently." We left the session quiet but aligned. On the anniversary of the court ruling, I did something symbolic. I took the copy of the forged will, the one I'd kept for my records, and shredded it, piece by piece. The sound was oddly satisfying, final. I didn't feel anger as I did it, I felt release. That document no longer held power over me. That evening, sitting alone, with the windows open, spring air drifting in, I thought about how close I'd come to staying silent, to accepting something that felt wrong because it was easier. Silence would have preserved appearances, but it would have cost me my sense of self. Now, when I look back, I don't see a story about money. I see a story about voice, about what happens when you finally trust yourself enough to speak, even when your voice shakes, and how sometimes the most meaningful inheritance is the courage to tell the truth and live with it. There is a point after conflict has burned through everything it can touch when life asks a quieter question. Now what? Not in a demanding way, not urgently, just patiently, like it knows you're finally ready to answer. For me, that question arrived one ordinary morning while I was standing in the grocery store comparing 2 jars of pasta sauce. I realized I wasn't distracted. I wasn't replaying conversations or bracing for bad news. I was simply there, present. The thought startled me. I began to notice how much emotional space had been freed up. I laughed more easily. I slept more deeply. I stopped checking my phone compulsively, half expecting another problem to solve. Even my body felt different, lighter, less guarded. It made me wonder how long I'd been living in a state of quiet vigilance, mistaking it for normal. Elaine and I continued our therapy sessions, but they shifted in tone. Less crisis management, more reflection. One afternoon, the therapist asked us to describe each other as children. Elaine smiled faintly. She was observant, always watching, always listening. I added, Elaine was decisive. She stepped in when others hesitated. The therapist nodded. Those qualities didn't disappear, she said. They just got distorted under pressure. That idea stayed with me. We aren't transformed by hardship, we're revealed. That summer, Elaine invited me to join her for a weekend trip. Nothing extravagant, just a small town near the coast. I hesitated, then agreed. The drive was quiet at first, the road humming beneath the tires. Eventually, Elaine spoke. I used to think closeness meant dependency, she said, that if I let you stand on your own, I'd be unnecessary. I watched the landscape roll by. I used to think independence meant isolation, that needing someone was weakness. We shared a glance, 2 halves of the same misunderstanding. The weekend was simple. Walks along the water, shared meals, long pauses filled with the sound of waves. No heavy conversations, no rehashing the past, just presence. On the last night, as we watched the sun dip into the ocean, Elaine said quietly, I'm glad we didn't lose each other. I nodded. Me too. Back home, I felt something settle into permanence. Not happiness, happiness comes and goes, but steadiness. The scholarship fund reached a milestone that fall. Enough had accumulated to guarantee its continuation for several years. At the small board meeting, someone suggested expanding it. What do you think? They asked me. I considered the question carefully. I think we should grow slowly, I said. Sustainability matters more than scale. The room agreed. I smiled to myself afterward. There was a time when I would have deferred automatically. Now, I trusted my judgment. One evening, Elaine called me with unexpected news. She said, I'm engaged. I paused, letting the words land. Congratulations, I said sincerely. I wanted you to hear it from me first, before anyone else. That mattered more than she probably realized. When I met her fiancé later, I noticed how she listened to him, really listened, how she didn't interrupt or direct the conversation. People can change, but only if they want to. I found myself reflecting more often on legacy, not the kind measured in assets, but in patterns. What habits do we pass down without realizing it? What fears masquerade as responsibility? What silences get mistaken for peace? These questions shaped how I move through the world now, at work, in friendships, in myself. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, I sat in my study and wrote a letter, not to anyone in particular, just to the version of myself who'd sat in that attorney's office, heart pounding, afraid to ask too many questions. You didn't imagine it, I wrote, and you weren't wrong to want clarity. You were brave even when you felt small. I folded the letter and placed it in the back of my mother's notebook. A conversation completed. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how stories like mine often get reduced to a single headline: inheritance dispute divides family. But the truth was far more layered. This wasn't a story about division, it was a story about confrontation and what can happen when you choose honesty over convenience. About how telling the truth doesn't always end relationships. Sometimes it transforms them. As sleep pulled me under, one thought lingered. The hardest battles aren't fought in courtrooms, they're fought inside us, between fear and integrity, silence and voice. I had chosen my side, and I would choose it again. There is a point, after conflict has burned through everything it can touch, when life asks a quieter question. Now what? Not in a demanding way, not urgently, just patiently, like it knows you're finally ready to answer. For me, that question arrived one ordinary morning while I was standing in the grocery store comparing 2 jars of pasta sauce. I realized I wasn't distracted. I wasn't replaying conversations or bracing for bad news. I was simply there, present. The thought startled me. I began to notice how much emotional space had been freed up. I laughed more easily. I slept more deeply. I stopped checking my phone compulsively, half expecting another problem to solve. Even my body felt different, lighter, less guarded. It made me wonder how long I'd been living in a state of quiet vigilance, mistaking it for normal. Elaine and I continued our therapy sessions, but they shifted in tone. Less crisis management, more reflection. One afternoon, the therapist asked us to describe each other as children. Elaine smiled faintly. She was observant, always watching, always listening. I added, Elaine was decisive. She stepped in when others hesitated. The therapist nodded. Those qualities didn't disappear, she said. They just got distorted under pressure. That idea stayed with me. We aren't transformed by hardship, we're revealed. That summer, Elaine invited me to join her for a weekend trip. Nothing extravagant, just a small town near the coast. I hesitated, then agreed. The drive was quiet at first, the road humming beneath the tires. Eventually, Elaine spoke. I used to think closeness meant dependency, she said, that if I let you stand on your own, I'd be unnecessary. I watched the landscape roll by. I used to think independence meant isolation, that needing someone was weakness. We shared a glance, 2 halves of the same misunderstanding. The weekend was simple: walks along the water, shared meals, long pauses filled with the sound of waves. No heavy conversations, no rehashing the past, just presence. On the last night, as we watched the sun dip into the ocean, Elaine said quietly, I'm glad we didn't lose each other. I nodded. Me too. Back home, I felt something settle into permanence. Not happiness, happiness comes and goes, but steadiness. The scholarship fund reached a milestone that fall. Enough had accumulated to guarantee its continuation for several years. At the small board meeting, someone suggested expanding it. What do you think? They asked me. I considered the question carefully. I think we should grow slowly, I said. Sustainability matters more than scale. The room agreed. I smiled to myself afterward. There was a time when I would have deferred automatically. Now, I trusted my judgment. One evening, Elaine called me with unexpected news. She said, I'm engaged. I paused, letting the words land. Congratulations, I said sincerely. I wanted you to hear it from me first, before anyone else. That mattered more than she probably realized. When I met her fiancé later, I noticed how she listened to him, really listened, how she didn't interrupt or direct the conversation. People can change, but only if they want to. I found myself reflecting more often on legacy, not the kind measured in assets, but in patterns. What habits do we pass down without realizing it? What fears masquerade as responsibility? What silences get mistaken for peace? These questions shaped how I move through the world now, at work, in friendships, in myself. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, I sat in my study and wrote a letter, not to anyone in particular, just to the version of myself who'd sat in that attorney's office, heart pounding, afraid to ask too many questions. You didn't imagine it, I wrote, and you weren't wrong to want clarity. You were brave even when you felt small. I folded the letter and placed it in the back of my mother's notebook. A conversation completed. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how stories like mine often get reduced to a single headline: inheritance dispute divides family. But the truth was far more layered. This wasn't a story about division, it was a story about confrontation and what can happen when you choose honesty over convenience. About how telling the truth doesn't always end relationships. Sometimes it transforms them. As sleep pulled me under, one thought lingered. The hardest battles aren't fought in courtrooms. They're fought inside us, between fear and integrity, silence and voice. I had chosen my side, and I would choose it again. There are moments when life circles back, not to test you again, but to see if you've learned. Mine came in the form of a phone call I hadn't expected and didn't immediately recognize. The number was unfamiliar. I let it ring twice before answering. "This is Daniel Mercer," a man said, his voice measured and professional. "I represent the State Bar's Ethics Committee." My heart gave a small, steady thump. Not panic, just awareness. "Yes," I replied. "How can I help you?" He explained that the attorney who had initially handled our inheritance case, Mr. Calder, was under review. Several complaints had surfaced, and they were reaching out to individuals involved in matters he'd overseen. "We're gathering first-hand accounts," Daniel said. "Your name came up." I closed my eyes briefly. The past doesn't disappear just because you've made peace with it. We scheduled a meeting for the following week. In the days leading up to it, I noticed an old tension stirring, not fear, but fatigue, the kind that comes from reopening chapters you've already read to the end. Elaine called when she heard. "They contacted you too?" she asked. "Yes." She exhaled sharply. "I was hoping it wouldn't come to this." "Why?" I asked gently. "Because it means facing what I did again." I paused. "That's not necessarily a bad thing." Silence stretched between us. "I know," she said finally. "I just don't want to hurt you again." "You won't, not by telling the truth." The meeting took place in a modest office building downtown. Neutral colors, soft lighting, a clock ticking faintly on the wall. Daniel sat across from me with a notepad. "This isn't a trial. There are no right or wrong answers. We're just documenting experiences." I nodded. "I understand." And then I spoke. I talked about the delayed filings, the altered documents, the way questions were deflected, how my sister had been positioned as the primary point of contact without my consent. I didn't embellish, I didn't dramatize, I just told the truth. Daniel listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification. When I finished, he leaned back slightly. "Thank you," he said. "Your account aligns with several others." I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that it hadn't been in my head, sadness that it had happened at all. Outside, the air was crisp. I walked slowly, letting the city move around me. There was a time when justice felt like a sharp weapon, something to wield. Now it felt more like balance being restored. That evening, Elaine came over for dinner. We cooked together, something we hadn't done since before everything unraveled. The rhythm felt familiar, passing ingredients, commenting on seasoning, working side by side. At one point, she stopped and looked at me. "Do you resent me for how this all turned out?" she asked. I thought carefully before answering. "I resented what you did, but I don't resent who you are now." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "That means more than you know," she said. A month later, we received the official notice. Mr. Calder's license had been suspended pending further investigation. Elaine called me as soon as she read it. I feel conflicted, she admitted. That makes sense, I said. Accountability isn't supposed to feel good. No, she agreed, but it feels necessary. The news rippled quietly through our extended family. There were murmurs, opinions, speculation. Some people praised me for standing my ground. Others implied I should have kept it private. I listened without reacting. I had learned that not every opinion deserved space in my heart. One afternoon, I met with a young woman at the legal aid clinic. She was dealing with an estate dispute of her own, overwhelmed and unsure. "They make you feel small, like you're asking for too much," she said, her voice trembling. "You're not asking for too much," I told her. "You're asking for what's right." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. In that moment, I realized how far I'd come. I was no longer just surviving my story, I was using it. Elaine and I marked a year since our mother's passing with a quiet visit to her favorite park. We sat on a bench, watching leaves fall. "She always hated unfinished business," Elaine said softly. I smiled. "She would have been proud of you for facing yours." Elaine swallowed hard. "I hope so." As we stood to leave, she reached out and squeezed my hand. "Thank you," she said, "for not walking away." I squeezed back. "Thank you for walking forward." That night, at home, I lit a candle and placed it near my mother's photograph. "I did my best," I whispered, "not for approval, just acknowledgement." The flame flickered gently, steady and warm. The truth is, closure doesn't come from winning. It comes from alignment, when your actions finally match your values. I had found that alignment, and I intended to keep it. Time has a way of smoothing the sharpest edges, not by erasing them, but by teaching you where not to press. By the time spring arrived, the world outside seemed to mirror what was happening inside me. Buds on branches, longer light in the evenings, a sense of forward motion that didn't feel forced. I was learning how to live after the storm. One Saturday morning, I opened my mail to find an envelope from the trust management firm. Nothing alarming, just an annual review summary. Still, my hands paused for a moment before opening it. Old reflex. I took a breath and reminded myself, "You are informed now. You are protected." The numbers were clear, transparent, exactly where they were supposed to be. I smiled, not because of the money, but because of what it represented. Stability built on truth. Later that day, Elaine and I met for coffee. She was already seated when I arrived, stirring her drink absently. "You look lighter," she said as I sat down. "I feel lighter," I replied. She nodded. "I've been thinking about downsizing, selling the house." I raised an eyebrow. "That's a big step." "I don't need all that space anymore," she said. "I think I kept it because it made me feel anchored, but now I want something simpler." I understood that impulse well. "Whatever you choose," I said, "make sure it's for you." She smiled. "I'm learning how to do that." That week, I received an email from the scholarship committee. A student had written a thank you letter. She described being the first in her family to attend college, how the financial support had lifted a burden she didn't have words for. "I promise," she wrote, "to use this opportunity well." I read the letter twice, then set it down carefully. This was why the inheritance mattered, not as a reward, as a responsibility. I thought often about my mother during those moments, about how she used to say, "Money only amplifies who you already are." At the time, I thought it was one of her sayings, something half true, half philosophical. Now I understood. Elaine called me one evening, her voice quieter than usual. "I met with my therapist today," she said. "We talked about envy." I waited. I didn't envy your inheritance. I envied your freedom, your certainty. I swallowed. I didn't feel certain, I admitted. I was terrified. I know, she said, but you still moved forward. There was a pause. I'm proud of you, she added. The words landed gently but deeply. Thank you, I said. That means a lot. As the summer approached, the legal aid clinic invited me to speak at a small workshop about navigating estate disputes. I almost said no. Public speaking had never been my comfort zone, but something in me felt ready. So I stood in front of a modest room, folding chairs, paper cups of water, and told my story. Not all the details, just enough. I spoke about intuition, about asking questions, about not letting guilt silence you. When I finished, a man in the back raised his hand. How did you deal with the fear of losing family? He asked. I thought carefully before answering. I asked myself, I said, whether keeping the peace was worth losing myself. The room was quiet. Sometimes the hardest truths are the simplest. Afterwards, several people approached me, thanked me, shared pieces of their own stories. I drove home feeling something new. Purpose. That night, I dreamed of my mother. She was standing in the kitchen, humming softly, a dish towel over her shoulder. You did okay, she said, smiling. I woke up with tears on my cheeks, but they weren't heavy. They were clean. Elaine and I continued to redefine what sisterhood meant to us. We didn't pretend nothing had happened. We also didn't let it define everything. We talked about boundaries openly, about expectations, about how to handle conflict before it hardened into resentment. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. One afternoon, Elaine and I were walking through a farmer's market, and Elaine stopped suddenly. I want to apologize, she said. I turned to her. For what? For assuming you'd always make yourself smaller so I could feel bigger. The honesty in her voice caught me off guard. I forgive you, I said quietly, but I won't do that anymore. She nodded. I wouldn't want you to. As the year continued, I realized something profound. The inheritance had changed my life, but not in the way people imagine. It hadn't bought happiness or erased pain. What it had done, what the fight for it had done, was teach me how to stand in my own truth, how to choose integrity over approval, how to trust myself again. Some nights I still think about that first meeting with the attorney, the shock, the disbelief. If I could speak to that version of myself now, I'd say this: the money isn't the miracle. You are. I turned off the lights and sat in the quiet, feeling deeply at ease. Not because everything was settled, but because I was.
There's a certain kind of silence that only comes after you've told the truth enough times that it no longer echoes back at you. That was the silence I found myself living in. Not empty, not lonely, just settled. By early autumn, routines had returned to my life in a way that felt different than before. Mornings were slower. I woke without that tight knot in my stomach, without mentally scanning for problems before my seat even touched the floor. I made coffee and actually tasted it. I lingered over the newspaper, watered my plants, let the day arrive instead of bracing for it. It amazed me how much energy fear had once taken, how much space it had occupied without my permission. One afternoon, Elaine came over unexpectedly. She stood in my doorway holding a small cardboard box. I brought something, she said. Inside were old photographs, letters, small keepsakes from our childhood, things she'd found while packing up her house. I didn't want to throw them away, she said, but I didn't want to decide alone either. We sat on the floor, sorting through memories. There was a photo of us on a beach, our hair tangled by wind, laughing at something forgotten. A postcard from our mother, written in looping handwriting. A birthday card Elaine had made for me when she was 8, the edges uneven from dull scissors. I forgot how close we were, Elaine whispered. So did I said. Grief isn't always about loss. Sometimes it's about distance you didn't realize had grown. As the afternoon light faded, Elaine hesitated before speaking. I'm scared, she admitted. Of what? Of becoming irrelevant, she said, of not being needed. I looked at her carefully. You don't have to earn your place in my life, I said. You just have to show up, honestly. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I'm trying. I can see that. And I meant it. A week later, I received a letter from the state bar. The investigation into Mr. Calder had concluded. His license was revoked permanently. I read the words slowly. No triumph, no satisfaction, just a quiet sense of finality. Justice doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it feels like a door closing softly behind you. That evening, I went for a long walk through my neighborhood. Leaves crunched beneath my feet. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke. I thought about accountability, how uncomfortable it is, how necessary, about how systems fail not because people are evil, but because they rely on silence to function. I had chosen not to be silent. That choice had rippled farther than I ever intended. At the legal aid clinic, my role expanded. I began mentoring newer volunteers, helping them learn how to listen, really listen, to people who felt overwhelmed and dismissed. You don't need all the answers, you just need to take people seriously, I told them. That had made all the difference for me. Elaine invited me to her new apartment shortly after she moved. It was smaller, brighter, minimal. I didn't realize how much stuff I had, she said, laughing softly. Stuff can weigh you down, I replied. She glanced at me. So can secrets. We shared a look of mutual understanding. Over dinner, she told me about her wedding plans, modest, intimate. I want to start this part of my life without pretending, she said. That sounds wise, I said. She hesitated. Would you walk me down the aisle? The question surprised me. I felt a lump form in my throat. Yes, I said after a moment. I would. Her smile was radiant, unguarded. That night, alone in my home, I reflected on how far we'd come, not back to where we started, but somewhere better, somewhere truer. I often thought about how betrayal reshapes your understanding of love. It strips away illusion, leaves you with a choice, become guarded forever, or rebuild with intention. I had chosen intention. One evening, as I organized files in my study, I came across the original documents from the inheritance case. I paused, then carefully placed them into a labeled folder. I no longer needed to keep them close. Their purpose had been served. Before bed, I stood by the window and watched the moon rise. I thought about my mother, about what she might have hoped for us. Not perfection, but honesty. Not harmony at any cost, but connection grounded in truth. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't something I'd granted Elaine in a single moment. It had been a series of small choices, each one deliberate, each one earned. As I turned off the light, a calm certainty settled over me. I was no longer defined by what had been taken from me or what I almost lost. I was defined by what I chose to protect. My voice, my values, my sense of self. And that, more than any inheritance, was something no one could ever steal.
Life has a way of testing your growth, not with chaos, but with choice. By the time winter returned, my days had settled into something steady and familiar, not boring, just honest, the kind of life that doesn't need constant explanation. And then, one afternoon, I received a letter addressed in handwriting I recognized instantly. Elaine's. I smiled before I even opened it. Inside was an invitation, not just to her wedding, but to something more intimate. She had written a long note, the kind people only write when they finally learned how to sit with their thoughts. I know I've said sorry before, she wrote, but I don't think I ever explained what I was really apologizing for. I sat down and read slowly. She wrote about childhood, the pressure she'd always felt to be the strong one, the reliable one, about how responsibility had hardened into control without her realizing it, about how watching me receive the inheritance had triggered her fear she'd never named, that she was replaceable. "I didn't want your money," she wrote. "I wanted proof that I mattered just as much." My chest tightened. I see now how wrong that was, and I'm learning how to matter without taking. I folded the letter carefully. Some apologies don't ask for forgiveness, they offer understanding. The wedding was held on a cold but clear afternoon in January, a small chapel softly lit, white flowers, simple music. As I waited beside Elaine at the back, I felt her hand tremble slightly in mine. "You okay?" I whispered. She nodded. "I am now." We walked together down the aisle, not as a performance, but as a quiet statement. Witness, support, choice. When she reached the altar, she squeezed my hand once more before letting go. I took my seat with a heart that felt unexpectedly full. The ceremony was brief, sincere, no grand speeches, just vows spoken clearly, deliberately. When Elaine said, "I promise to be honest even when it's uncomfortable," I believed her, because I had seen the cost of dishonesty. At the reception, people laughed easily. There was warmth in the room, not forced, not performative. Several relatives approached me, some cautiously, others openly. "I'm glad you're here," one said. "So am I replied, and I meant it. Later, Elaine found me near the window. "I'm grateful," she said quietly. "For what?" "For the chance to grow," she said, "even when I didn't deserve it." I looked at her carefully. "Growth isn't a reward, it's a responsibility." She nodded. "I won't waste it." After the wedding, life resumed its gentle pace, but something subtle had shifted. I felt complete. Not because everything was resolved, but because nothing was unresolved inside me. One morning at the clinic, a young man came in with his mother. They were arguing quietly, tension thick between them. He reminded me of us. When they sat down, I listened, not just to their words, but to what wasn't being said. At one point, I gently asked, "What are you afraid of losing?" The room went quiet. That question changed everything. Driving home later, I reflected on how conflict often masks fear. Fear of being unseen, fear of being powerless, fear of not being loved enough. Understanding that doesn't excuse harm, but it does offer a path forward. That evening, I cooked dinner slowly, deliberately, played soft music, let myself enjoy the process. As I ate, I thought about the money, the inheritance that had once loomed so large. It was still there, still meaningful, but it no longer defined the story. Before bed, I opened my journal and wrote, "What I gained was never just financial security. It was the courage to insist on truth, the strength to let go of guilt, the wisdom to rebuild without denial." I paused, then added one final line, "and the grace to see my sister clearly, not as an enemy, but as a flawed human capable of change." As the house settled into silence, I felt something rare. Contentment without conditions, peace without denial. I turned out the light, knowing something deep and steady had taken root in me. Whatever came next, I would meet it whole. There's a quiet kind of courage that comes after everything loud has already happened. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need witnesses. It simply shows up, day after day, in the choices you make when no one is watching. That was the season I entered next. In early spring, I found myself standing in the same attorney's office where the story had first begun, though this time it was a different building, a different firm, a different energy entirely. The walls were lined with books, the windows were open. The air felt honest. I was there to revise my own estate plans, not because I expected anything to happen, but because clarity had become a habit. The attorney, a woman about my age, spoke calmly as we reviewed documents. "Is there anyone you'd like to exclude?" she asked gently. I thought about the question longer than she probably expected. "No," I said finally, "but I want everything to be transparent. No confusion, no room for interpretation." She smiled. "That's usually how families stay families." I nodded. Some lessons arrive late, but they stay. Later that afternoon, Elaine and I met for lunch. She was glowing in that newly married way, not dramatic, just settled. "How did it feel?" she asked, referring to the attorney meeting. "Empowering," I said, like I was finally writing my own fine print. She laughed softly. "I'm proud of you." I paused, then added, "I've listed you as my medical proxy." Her smile faded into something more serious. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "because now I trust you to act, not out of fear, but out of care." Her eyes filled and she reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "I won't fail you," she said. "I know," I replied, and I did. That trust hadn't come easily. It had been rebuilt, brick by brick, through accountability, boundaries, and time. People think forgiveness is about erasing the past, but it isn't. It's about deciding what the past is allowed to influence. At the Scholarship Fund, we announced a new initiative, mentorship pairings between recipients and donors. I volunteered to be part of the pilot program. The student I was paired with was quiet at first, cautious. She reminded me of myself during the worst of it, guarded, observant, unsure who was safe. Over coffee one afternoon, she asked me, "How did you know when to stop fighting?" I considered the question carefully. I didn't stop fighting, I just stopped fighting the wrong battles. She nodded slowly. Sometimes wisdom lands exactly where it's needed. One evening, Elaine called me unexpectedly. "I had a dream about Mom," she said. "What happened?" She was sitting at the table folding napkins. She looked up and said, "I'm glad you two found your way back." My throat tightened. "I think she'd be proud," I said. "I think so too," Elaine replied. That night, I took out my mother's old recipe box, the one with stained cards and handwritten notes in the margins. I chose a dish she used to make for me when we were kids, something simple, familiar. As it cooked, the smell filled the kitchen, pulling memories forward. Laughter, arguments, long afternoons that felt endless at the time. Life, lived imperfectly. As I ate alone at the table, I realized something important. The inheritance had been a catalyst, but it hadn't been the story. The story had always been about voice, about the moment I stopped minimizing my instincts to keep others comfortable, about choosing honesty even when it fractured illusions. I thought about how many people stay silent because they're afraid of what truth will cost them. But silence has a cost too. It just invoices you slowly. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how differently I navigated relationships. I asked direct questions. I expressed needs without apology. I listened without preparing a defense. And when something felt wrong, I trusted that feeling every time. Elaine and I established new traditions, monthly dinners, shared holidays, honest check-ins, not obligation, choice, and that made all the difference. One afternoon, as we walked through a park, Elaine said something that stopped me. "I used to think you were stronger than me," she said. "Now I realize we were just strong in different ways." I smiled. Strength doesn't have to compete. She nodded. "I'm glad I finally learned that." As the days grew longer, I found myself thinking less about what had been taken from me and more about what I had gained. Not just money, but discernment, self-respect, the ability to stand firm without becoming hard. One evening, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked peaceful, not untouched by life, but shaped by it. I whispered quietly, "Thank you." Not to the money, not to the conflict, but to myself for not walking away from the truth. Because the bravest thing I ever did wasn't fighting for the inheritance. It was believing I deserved honesty in my family, in my life, and in myself. There's a moment after enough healing has happened when you stop measuring your life against the wound. You don't wake up thinking about it. You don't brace for it. You don't even tell the story the same way anymore. That was where I found myself. It happened on an ordinary afternoon while I was cleaning out a closet. I came across a small box tucked behind old coats. Inside were documents I no longer needed to keep close, copies of court filings, correspondence, notes scribbled during late nights when sleep wouldn't come. I sat on the floor and went through them slowly, not with anger, not with fear, just with acknowledgement. These papers had once represented danger, loss, betrayal. Now they were simply proof that I had survived something difficult without losing myself. I shredded most of them that afternoon, not dramatically, just methodically. Letting go doesn't always require ceremony. That evening, Elaine stopped by unannounced. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, holding up a bag of takeout. "Thought I'd check in." We ate at the kitchen table, trading stories about our week. At one point, she looked around my home and said, "You've changed this place." I glanced around too. It needed to change with me. She nodded thoughtfully. "I think I did the same." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment. "I want to thank you," she said suddenly. "For what?" "For not letting me stay the person I was becoming," she said. "You forced me to see myself." I met her gaze. "You chose to look." She smiled. "True." Later that night, I received an email from the scholarship fund. Another student had graduated, another story of resilience, another quiet ripple moving outward. I realized then how different my relationship with money had become. It no longer felt like a prize. It felt like stewardship. As summer approached again, marking nearly 2 years since my mother's passing, Elaine suggested we do something together to honor her. "Nothing big," she said, "just something meaningful." We decided to donate a bench in her name at the park she loved. On the day it was installed, we sat there side by side, reading the inscription. "In loving memory, a place to rest, a place to reflect." Elaine wiped her eyes. "She would have liked this." "Yes," I said, "she would have." We sat there longer than planned, watching people pass by, joggers, parents, couples holding hands. Life moving forward without asking permission. I thought about how close we'd come to losing each other completely, not because of money, but because of fear left unspoken. On the drive home, Elaine said something quietly. "I don't want secrets anymore," she said, "in any part of my life." I smiled. "Neither do I." That mutual promise felt like the real inheritance. At home that night, I opened my journal for the first time in weeks. I wrote about the bench, about the park, about the strange peace of standing in a place where pain had once threatened to define everything. Then I wrote something I hadn't planned. Betrayal doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from unmet needs that turn toxic when ignored. But healing comes from facing those needs honestly, without stealing from others to fill them. I closed the journal, feeling complete. In the following weeks, life offered no dramatic tests, just quiet opportunities to live differently, to speak sooner, to listen deeper, to trust slowly but fully. One afternoon, I ran into the attorney who had represented me during the case. She smiled warmly. "You look well," she said. "I am." "You know," she added, "not everyone walks away from something like that with their integrity intact." I thought about her words later. Integrity isn't something you prove once, it's something you practice. As the anniversary of my mother's death approached, I felt no dread, only remembrance. Elaine and I planned a simple dinner, her favorite meal, candles, stories, no heavy speeches, just gratitude. That night, after Elaine left, I stood alone in my living room. I thought about the person I had been before all of this began, cautious, accommodating, afraid of disruption. I didn't judge that version of myself. She had done the best she could with what she knew, but I was grateful not to be her anymore. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark for a moment. There was no ache, no unfinished business, just a steady sense of readiness. Because the story wasn't about what my sister almost took from me. It was about what I almost gave up. My voice, my boundaries, my truth. And in the end, those were the things worth fighting for. There's a strange thing that happens when a long chapter finally closes. You don't hear it shut. You just notice one day that the noise is gone. I noticed it on a quiet morning, standing at my kitchen window, watching sunlight stretch across the floor. No urgency pulling at me, no old conversations replaying in my head, no sense that I needed to brace myself for what might come next. Just stillness and gratitude, not the loud kind, the settled kind. I used to think stories like mine ended with victory or loss, with someone winning and someone else paying the price. But that isn't how real life resolves itself. Real life asks a softer question. Who did you become because of this? I became someone who listens to that small, persistent voice inside, the one that whispers when something feels off, even when everything looks fine on paper. I became someone who understands that silence can be a form of self-betrayal, that peace built on denial isn't peace at all. When the attorney first told me I had inherited $1.9 million, I thought the miracle was financial. I thought relief would arrive in neat figures and signatures. But money didn't save me. Truth did. The money didn't teach me how to stand up to my sister. Courage did. It didn't teach me how to face family disappointment. Integrity did. It didn't teach me how to forgive. Time, accountability, and boundaries did. And here's the part people don't like to hear. Standing up for myself didn't destroy my family. Pretending everything was fine almost did. I know there are people listening to this who are sitting with a secret heaviness right now, a will that doesn't feel right, a family agreement that leaves you uneasy, a silence you're maintaining because you're afraid of what speaking up might cost. You may be telling yourself, it's not worth the conflict. I don't want to look greedy. I don't want to lose them. I told myself all those things too. But here's what I learned the hard way. If something is taken from you in silence, it doesn't stay quiet inside you. It turns into resentment, into doubt, into a slow erosion of self-trust. And that cost is far greater than any inheritance. My sister and I didn't rebuild our relationship because I gave in. We rebuilt it because the truth finally had somewhere to stand, because accountability replaced denial, because fear stopped running the conversation. Today, when I look at my life, I don't see a woman who won an inheritance dispute. I see a woman who learned how to take herself seriously, who learned that boundaries are not cruelty, that asking questions is not betrayal, that protecting your integrity is not the same as punishing others. And I see a sister who learned, painfully, imperfectly, that love cannot be built on control, that security taken from someone else is never secure at all. We didn't return to who we used to be. We became something more honest, something more grown, something more real. If my story leaves you with anything, I hope it's this. You are not wrong for wanting clarity. You are not selfish for asking for fairness, and you are not heartless for choosing truth over silence. Sometimes the bravest thing you can say is, "Something isn't right, and I won't pretend it is." Even if your voice shakes, even if your hands tremble, even if the people you love don't understand right away. Because when the dust settles, when the noise fades, when the chapter finally closes, you'll still have yourself, your voice, your values, your peace. And that is an inheritance no one can ever steal.